It was a regular Tuesday afternoon at one of the busiest cafes in downtown Chicago. The clinking of cups and the buzz of conversations filled the air as sunlight poured in through the windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden floors. But among the crowd, a young girl named Emma stood out, her bright eyes full of curiosity and her face partially hidden behind the frayed apron of her mother, Sarah, the waitress. Sarah had worked at the cafe for years, serving coffee and pastries with a smile despite the long hours and minimal pay. Emma, only 12, would often accompany her mother after school, sitting quietly in a corner, drawing pictures or reading books. The cafe had become a second home for the young girl, and the regular customers knew her well. Despite their differences in social standing, there was a subtle camaraderie between them all. One day, a well-dressed man entered the cafe, exuding confidence. He was known to everyone in the city, David Campbell, the CEO of a prominent tech company. His reputation as a successful businessman and occasional philanthropist preceded him. He was the kind of person people tried to impress, and he was accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Sarah was in the middle of serving another table when David sat down, nodding to her with a charming smile. She returned the smile politely, her hand slightly trembling as she set the menu in front of him. "Could you please tell me your daughter's name?" David asked, pointing to Emma, who was sitting by the window, lost in her thoughts. Sarah looked up, her face softening as she glanced at her daughter. "That's Emma," she said warmly, proud of the little girl who, despite the hard life they led, always brought light into their world. David, noticing Emma's quiet demeanor, decided to strike up a conversation. "Emma, what do you like to do for fun? Maybe play a little violin for us?" He laughed, thinking it was a harmless jest, a simple comment to break the ice. Emma, who had been quietly observing her mother's interactions with the customers, looked up in surprise. No one had ever asked her to perform before. Sarah, who was busy attending to other tables, didn't notice the exchange right away. I don't play the violin," Emma muttered shyly, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "Oh, I see," David chuckled. "But you must have something special hidden away, right? Go ahead, play us a tune. I'm sure you have a talent to show off." David's words, meant to be light-hearted, hung in the air, a joke that Emma wasn't sure how to react to. The other customers overheard, and a few of them started whispering among themselves, curious about whether Emma would actually perform. Sarah walked back to their table just in time to hear David's suggestion. Her eyes widened in confusion, but before she could speak, Emma, to everyone's surprise, stood up slowly, her face flushed with embarrassment. She glanced at her mother for reassurance, who nodded gently, her eyes full of encouragement. With a hesitant but determined look, Emma made her way to the back of the cafe, where an old, dusty violin sat in a corner. It had been her mother's gift to her on her 10th birthday, a symbol of something better than their difficult circumstances, even though they couldn't afford lessons. Over time, Emma taught herself to play, using YouTube tutorials and borrowed books from the library. But she had never played in front of anyone. As Emma opened the violin case, the crowd in the cafe fell silent. David leaned forward, amused but intrigued. Emma, with trembling hands, lifted the bow and placed it carefully on the strings. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, Emma played. The first notes were shaky, her nerves evident in each trembling sound. But as she continued, something changed. The music, though imperfect, became a beautiful expression of her heart. Her fingers found the rhythm, and with every stroke of the bow, her confidence grew. The cafe that had once been filled with chatter now stood still, the room captivated by the raw, unrefined beauty of the music. David, who had originally thought this was just a passing joke, was stunned. The room was silent except for the music, and as Emma played on, it was as though time itself had slowed. The customers, once indifferent to the mundane hustle of everyday life, were now immersed in the moment, reminded of the beauty and power of human connection. When Emma finished, she set the violin down with a final, delicate note. The room erupted into applause, but Emma's face remained flushed with embarrassment. She quickly returned to her seat, her hands shaking as she hid behind her mother's apron. David sat there, speechless for a moment, his earlier amusement replaced by a deep sense of awe. He had expected a joke, something trivial. Instead, he had witnessed a young girl's quiet strength, a moment of unspoken vulnerability that had touched everyone in the room. Finally, David stood up, his voice cracking slightly. "That was incredible. I didn't expect that. You're very talented, Emma." Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. No one had ever taken her seriously. David smiled warmly. "You know, I think the world could use more people like you, people who aren't afraid to show who they really are, no matter what anyone expects." As the café continued to buzz with excitement over Emma's impromptu performance, David did something no one saw coming. He approached Sarah and handed her his business card. "If your daughter ever wants to take formal lessons, I'll make sure she has the best violin teacher in the city. I've also been thinking, perhaps she could join our company's charity event next month. It would be an honor to have her play." Sarah was taken aback, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at Emma. It wasn't just the opportunity for Emma to study music, it was the recognition, the acknowledgement that someone saw her for who she truly was, beyond the life they lived. That evening, as mother and daughter walked home, the weight of the day's event settled over them. Emma's hands were still trembling, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear or uncertainty. It was from a newfound sense of possibility. "I can't believe it, Mom," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He really meant it. He wants me to play at the event." Sarah smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "You are amazing, Emma. I've always known you had something special inside you." And from that day on, everything changed. Emma began taking violin lessons, and her talent blossomed in ways she never imagined. The once quiet café, which had only been a backdrop to her mother's work, now became the stage for Emma's dreams. And every time she played, whether it was in front of a crowd or just for herself, she remembered the moment when a CEO, who had once seen her as a joke, helped her realize her worth. David Campbell's simple, unexpected act of encouragement had transformed Emma's life, but more importantly, it reminded everyone in the room that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples of change in ways we never expect. The power of humanity, of seeing each other for who we truly are, was all it took to light the spark of something extraordinary. And Emma? She was no longer just the waitress's daughter. She was a young girl with a dream, a violin, and the world at her feet.